Hey, good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the channel. I went back in time to a pair of videos that we did a year ago that I think illustrate really well how the controllers want to hack into our brains using copper to raise up their copper 5G base stations in the wilderness to control humanity, just like in the Bible. There is nothing new under the sun. And these things repeat over and over again throughout history. And this is what proves that there is a Most High, and it proves that there is the devil. So we're going to begin here. And I may interject and interrupt myself at certain points of this playlist. It's just 2 videos. I might fast forward through some of it. So if you see that happening, that's the reason. But the good news is I'll be in the chat with you guys while this is playing, and we can kind of talk about some of the concepts, and we'll also tie this into what's happening right now. Let's begin. And today we're going to talk about Jive G. And the reason why we're going to talk about Jive G today is because yesterday I read an amazing post by a subscriber named Aver Life in the comments section of yesterday's video. And the comment contained an epiphany that first in the Bible, Moses raised up the copper as a cure to the copper serpents that were punishing the Hebrews for begging God to go back to Egypt. And then later in history, Jesus compared himself to that copper serpent on a pole, and Jesus' feet were of copper, weren't they? And he was raised up on the cross. Now, I'm believing that his feet were probably bronze because that's where he was bruised by the bronze serpent. He was bruised on the feet, the heels. This is why you get foot washing in the Bible as part of Jesus' ministry, dusting off the cursed dust off of the feet. This is what he told his disciples to do if they weren't accepted in the town during their ministry. They were to dust their feet off and go to the next town. This was all symbolic as well as real. He was telling them to wash away the cursed dust. And then Aver Life realized this really amazing metaphor that now the enemy in our contemporary times is trying to raise himself above the Most High once again by lifting up the serpent in the form of copper Jive G, raising up the serpent on a pole. Now, the prince of the power of the airwaves, or the poles, is what this is really about. And we had discussed a little bit of this previously, that copper Jive G towers and base stations are full of copper, aren't they? 75,000 tons of copper is what is housed in these base stations all across America for Jive G. The copper snake-like wiring raised up on a pole, just like in ancient times. But not quite. Let's back up here for a second. Because 4G had the coaxial copper cables raised on a pole. Let me show you a picture of that. This is 4G, and they had the copper coaxial cables going up the pole, and then Jive G switched over to fiber optic. Now there's a power cable there, and that could have some copper in it, I don't know, but this is what we're dealing with, and we'll get into a little bit about this more later as the show progresses here. But there is a connection here, and it's undeniable that this is what is happening. Now, you'll notice these poles are likely metaphors, aren't they? They're likely metaphors for trees. Let's go back to this image here. Metaphors for trees, because they look like a tree, don't they? This is the older technology with the copper coaxial cables going up the pole. And here's the new technology, the fiber optic going up the pole. There is a power cable. Now, we'll talk about that and what that really means as we get into this, into more of the shows. But what an amazing revelation, right? Now, we know that many of these towers, just to confirm the tree aspect to this, many of these towers are actually disguised as artificial trees, aren't they? Now, let's go over some of the copper components inside of these base stations. Here's one. It's a coiled copper ring, as you can see here. Pure copper. Gives you an idea of the amount of copper that would be necessary to build all these base stations. Here's another copper component. These are copper conductive columns for Jive G base stations. Once again, so you can see these here. And here's another copper component. This is called a skived radiator for high power Jive G base stations. Once again, let's play this video, see what this looks like. There's some kind of cooling device. So yes, a lot of copper components. So now you're starting to get an idea of what's really going on here with copper and how this points right back to the Bible. And they know this is about the copper. Why? Look at this 2018 article about the Jive G chip. This was at the beginnings of the technology. And they show the size comparison of this chip next to none other than a copper penny. Now, coppers are only about 2 or 3% coated. I mean, pennies are only about 2 or 3% coated copper now, but they used to be solid copper. And so there's a reason why they use this copper penny to demonstrate the size, because they know that this is what this would be all about. Now, let's take a look at some of these Jive G towers and the base stations. And if you look here, down here, this is what the base station looks like. One of you actually sent me pictures. Connor, I think his name was, sent me pictures from England of these base stations. Some are small, some are big, some are in an array. So there's several of these cabinets. They look like cabinets. And some base stations are really large. They look like a small shed or something. But this base station is where all the copper is. And in the older technology, in 4G, the copper actually went up the pole. But something strange happened. When they went from 4G to Jive G, something strange happened. Because the serpent copper turned into optical fiber. And a particular scripture comes to mind. When the serpent transformed himself into an optic cable. I'm going to go back in the chat and see who gets the scripture. Who understands and remembers the scripture that seems to be a metaphor, or seems to be the fulfillment of prophecy for the serpent transforming himself? I just gave it away pretty much right there. Transforming himself into a fiber optic cable. Let's see who gets it. Tom says fiber optic light. Yes, he's giving a clue there. So you can spell out most of the scripture. Yes, Q&A time. Garrett says, poke out thine eyes. Not quite. Prince of the power of the air. That's one, but I'm looking for one that's more specific. Angel of light. Yes, create adult. The enemy shall transform himself into an angel of light. And it's exactly what he's done. Looking at this side-by-side picture of the old technology and the new technology. The serpent copper. Now, why do I call the copper serpent? Not only is this coaxial cable going up on the pole, just like the serpent was raised up on a pole, but the word for copper is nakasheth, which sounds exactly like or very similar to the word nakash for serpent. They're almost the same words. Those words also mean unclean. So you have unclean, copper, and serpents all pretty much meaning the same word in the ancient language. Now, let's keep going with this because there are more. Just my mind was blown yesterday when I dug into this and decided to dig into this because I was not expecting to find what I did. Let's get into some more of these specific components to the copper inside of these base stations. Let's read this next article here. Now, this article is called Fiber Optics and Requirements in Jive G Infrastructure. It says here, they improve upon legacy copper systems in terms of reliability, cost, speed, security, and bandwidth. It's fiber optics that make high-speed wireless networks possible. In fact, it can transmit up to, fiber can transmit up to 40 miles and still retain its signal strength. So they're replacing the copper, but as you see down here, they're saying that it's lighter than copper and all this. But they don't tell you is the base stations need the copper. Copper wire-based transmission depends on electrical signals passed through the cable. Fiber optics transmits signals in the form of light from one point to another. And this is where we get into the new technology and the dependence still on copper with these base stations. Vapor chamber cooling. This article, The Challenge of Thermal Management, Jive G. Let's read it down here about what role copper plays. Now I'm pausing this to interrupt myself. We're now back in 2023. This video was from 2022, and it's part of a two-part series, if you're just tuning in which we were talking about the similarities between the copper serpent raised on the pole and the 4G and 5G technology that is being brought to bear as we speak and beyond, and comparing it to the serpent in the wilderness that was raised up on a pole, transforming himself into an angel of light, going from copper serpent technology. The two words are the same. Nakash is serpent, Nakosheth is copper. They're almost the same Hebrew word. Transforming himself from that to light, which is fiber optic, and it seems to fulfill the prophecy in the Bible that says that he would do exactly that. Now, I just saw in our chat today that several of you mentioned coaxial cables. And the coaxial is the twisted pair. It's two trees twisted in on one another. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And I thought that was pretty amazing because also when you twist something, you reeve it or you coil it and it takes you through a portal. This is what the serpent wishes to do, to take us down the wide gate to destruction instead of the narrow gate back to Jesus. Several others of you in the chat mentioned that when you looked at telephone poles, that it reminded you of the crucifixion. And there are many times in my life where I've been driving down the road. This was when I was fast asleep. Driving down the road, looking up at telephone poles, and sometimes seeing three poles together that looked like the crucifixion. And it wasn't until this point in my life that I realized that those telephone lines were solid copper. What you were looking at was the copper on the cross. And others of you in the chat just mentioned that they would drive those spikes into the side of the copper or the telephone poles so that you could climb up them. And that was much like the spear pierced in the side of Jesus. So it's all around us, you guys. Let's keep watching here. Vapor chamber cooling. Copper plates can help dissipate heat by dispersing it towards the bottom of PCBs. This isn't 100% effective, as there are still hot spots to contend with. Very thin vapor chambers sandwiched between two copper plates between a liquid cavity can help. As the liquid heats up, it vaporizes, which dissipates the heat before condensing back into a liquid. Heat transfer thermal management of electronics can be effective. This involves thermal surface materials, which come in different formulations and formats. These materials transfer heat energy away from the components to heat sink, but here again, EMI can become a problem. So the heat sinks should be made of copper or aluminum. So copper plays a huge part in the base station wiring, as well as the cooling of the base station, so that the whole thing doesn't go up in flames. Now I'm going to interrupt myself again, because you have to start back from the beginning and see the continuity of this network. From the beginnings of network technology, from the telegraph to the telephone, all of it was copper wiring. And then they had these air tubes that they would use. Also, the power of the air. They would send air tubes. This was used in banking in some of the central cities. They used the very same lines that were used for the telegraph. They just replaced those pathways, which act much like arteries in the human body, or a neural network of the brain. This is the brain of the hive mind. It's all around us. This is why they want you in the grid, to keep you locked in the hive mind. Is all this starting to sink in now on a spiritual level? And then they replaced all of that with now the wireless technology, but that still needs lots of wires, right? Because it's not completely wireless. They're sending out signals. So we've almost gone, I want to say, well, we haven't gone backwards, but the wireless technology is now a thing. Let's keep watching here. Now, Connor sent some images from some real base stations in the UK. These are the cabinets that they're stored in. It says radio transmitters. Please obey all further signage. Here's a wider shot of it. Thanks, Connor, for getting us this information. Now, if you don't know, if you don't live in the UK, you probably don't know that one of the major networks is called 3. 3 is the name of one of the major mobile networks. But look at this. Almost looks like some kind of a dragon or something. And this cell phone network called 3 came online on March 3rd, 2003. So 333 is when this came online. There's some instructions on the back of this cabinet here. Here's a wide angle shot of the base stations, full of copper, remember. Lots of copper infrastructure necessary for the base stations. Here's another shot of it. Thanks, Connor, for sending us these pictures. Connor was doing his diligence here on the down low, secretly recording these images. I mean, look at this thing. It's just standing in plain sight, towering over the neighborhood. And if you didn't know this, many, many more towers are needed for 5G because of the nature of the frequencies compared to 4G and other older technology who basically were able to have towers much further apart. So we're going to be surrounded by this stuff. Here's another shot of it just sitting right there out on the corner. Now, I'm going to read you the rest of what Averlife had said in their comment. Brass is mainly an alloy that consists of copper with zinc added. They then quoted Ephesians 2:2, wherein in time past you walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that now worketh in the children of disobedience. Numbers 21:9, and Moses made a serpent of brass and put it upon a pole, and it came to pass that if a serpent had bitten any man, when he beheld the serpent of brass, he lived. And then they ask, does this tie into the image of the beast? Does Jive G target those who are not chipped? Is Jive G part of this image? If you've had the smack scene, will you need to remain in proximity to the copper on the polar tree? These are questions. And then quoted is Revelation 13:15. And he had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. Now, you can imagine that this system has the ability to process data in real time, project images, and everything else. So you can imagine that this could be a component of a future deception, the image of the beast. Now, I'm going to interrupt myself again because some of you in the chat are making really great points that connect with this and bring it all back together today. You noticed that Lincoln's image on the copper penny is reversed. He's the only president that's looking the opposite direction. Well, Lincoln was the telegraph president. And even though the telegraph wasn't widely used until after his assassination, under his presidency, the telegraph was used in wartime during the Civil War to basically communicate messages. And this is how they won the Civil War. So think about this. Lincoln was doing seances in the White House. He was possessed. And these were the beginnings of the wide control over humanity using the networks. The networks are the programming. Okay, that's how it's deceiving people. It's the programming. And you have to get the network to all parts of the earth in order for the programming to work, right? To program the most people. I don't believe that there's some magical thing that mind controls you from these networks. I think it's a programming thing. And if you're not deprogrammed, which is what we do on this channel, we deprogram everything and the agendas behind the deceptions, then you will be deceived. And I think that's what this is really all about. Let's keep watching here. Now, I'm going to check in with you guys, and then we're going to do the last and most important part of this show. This is the part that just blew me away, because we're going to talk about how copper fits in to mimicry or cloning, disguises and camouflage, because that's what the enemy does, doesn't he? He is a camouflage or a counterfeit of the original. He copies God's creation. He mimics God. And through his mimicry, he erodes faith and causes confusion, doesn't he? Now, I want to be clear about this before we get into the last part of the show. Jesus is not a snake. He wasn't comparing himself to the snake on the pole. The snake on the pole was a punishment, was a cure for a punishment, but God was teaching them a lesson, because they were begging and begging. If you go back and read the entire verse about what happened to the ancient Hebrews and why they got attacked with fiery serpents and why a pole was raised up, a blue-blooded snake pole, it was because it was all about punishment. Okay? Whereas Jesus came with love, didn't he? And mercy and grace. Those two are opposites of one another. Punishment versus grace. And that's why Jesus said, and if you read the scripture, He doesn't compare, he's not comparing himself. It says, as Moses lifted up a serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up. He's comparing both being lifted up, that whoever believeth in him should not perish. He wasn't saying he was the serpent. A lot of people get confused about that. And they try to like go, that's weird. Why would he? Think about it. Moses and Aaron were in the court of the pharaohs and went up against Janus and Jambres, J and J, didn't they? And Aaron threw down a staff and it turned into a snake. Well, God isn't like some snake monger. He was proving a point. He was basically showing up the Pharaoh, revealing and exposing his false snake god, which is the snake that comes out of their forehead, that they have in their headdresses. He was exposing it. That's why he made it turn into a snake. That's why he did it. You have to read between the lines in the Bible. And it all falls on where your heart is. If your heart is doubtful of God and you're looking for things to try to go, see, gotcha, then God will let you see that. If that's what you want to see and you don't want to have faith and you believe the mimicry of the enemy, then God will allow you to do that and fall under that delusion because your heart is not in the right place. My heart serves the Most High and I believe in his Son. So I'm always going, there's got to be a logical explanation for that. And when you really think about it, there always is a logical explanation for doubtful verses in the Bible. There always is. So Jesus, think of it this way. When Jesus came, he corrected the blue blood. He reversed the copper-based blood with his own pure blood of the woman. The red iron-based blood. It's pretty simple if you know everything and you can actually try to think things through. And it requires some research. It requires the path that we went on, that you're not going to hear when you go to the pulpit, because the pulpit doesn't know all of this stuff because they're under their own delusion. And so it is only through research of the Bible and studying to show yourself approved that you begin to fully understand why God would tell Moses to raise a serpent up on a pole to cure people. If you take the third grade version of it, then you'll just think that's weird and that's kind of weird. God would use a snake to cure people, but you got to think this through. You got to think deeper. Blue blood snake versus red blood Christ. The cure, the true cure, not a punishment, grace, belief in him. Those are the bullet points. And it makes perfect sense. And God's wisdom is infinite. It's amazing. So, let's get into the bombshell for the rest of the show. For those of you that showed up, this is nuts. So, I was watching a video of how Octopus can camouflage themselves within seconds. This happens. And if you've never seen this before, you need to go on to YouTube and look up camouflage octopus and watch an octopus swim along the bottom of the ocean and change their colors to almost identically match the seafloor or the coral or the sand or whatever it is they are swimming across. So I looked into this because we've been talking a lot about blue blood, haven't we? And hemocyanin-based blood, which are all these creatures like these octopus, squid, cuttlefish, all these creatures of the deep are hemocyanin-based creatures, copper-based blood. So I was like, okay, this has to be connected because the enemy also camouflages himself. He's a mimic. He's a clone. So this is what I found. I looked into how this worked. An octopus, because of their copper blood running through their veins, are able to control the pigment in their skin using electrical impulses. They can actually turn the color in each individual cell on or off or different shades. And the skin cells are called chromatophores, as you can see here. So, it was to my shock that I discovered this. Copper and pigmentation of skin and hair. Let me read this for you so you can understand this. The pigment of your skin is dependent on copper. Pronounced changes occur in the color of the fur of black or hooded rats that consume an excessive milk diet low in copper. A progressive disease in the amount of pigmentation occurred as a dietary regimen continued until finally the coat became silvery gray. So the pigment in the hair of these rats diminished when they had a diet low in copper. The administration of iron to the animals had no effect on the condition, but the feeding of a small amount of copper promoted a prompt restoration of the normal color of the fur. Almost simultaneously, another investigator demonstrated by actual analysis that the copper content of the skin of black rats and rabbits usually exceeded that of otherwise comparable white animals. Further studies suggest that copper might serve as a catalyst in the formation of pigment. Now, let's keep going with this. Copper deficiency in the skin. Pale skin. Color is greatly determined by the pigment melanin. I got some melanin in my skin, being of a mixed race. People with lighter skin have fewer and smaller, lighter melanin pigments than people with darker skin. Interestingly, copper is used by enzymes that produce melanin. So, I'm not saying that us people of color are serpents. That's not what I'm saying here. I'm saying that copper actually controls the amount of melanin in your skin. So if you don't have copper, your skin isn't going to be as dark. Now, here's where the plot thickens. Copper is used by an enzyme called tyrosinase. We're going to call it tyro for short, because it's a hard word to say. And basically, tyrosinase, or tyro, is what regulates melanin. It actually produces the melanin. It says here, oxidase, that is the rate-limiting enzyme for controlling the production of melanin. So, no copper, no melanin, and your skin goes pale. This is why we all need trace amounts of copper in our diet, but too much will poison you. So now, those old copper tone ads make all the sense in the world, don't they? Because in order to get the tone, the tyro, you need copper. And they know that. They know that a good tan is all about a little bit of copper. Now, tyro is not only found in humans and animal skin, it's also found in plants and fungus as well. And look at this. Here we are in the tyro Wikipedia page, and lo and behold, tridimensional structure of a functional unit from Octopus hemocyanin. This is right out of the blood of the octopus. Look at the structure, the three-dimensional structure of this thing. Right there in the octopus blood. Now, this was the confirmation for me that we were on the right track with digging into this. Now, those that genetically have less tyro have lighter skin. So, copper tyro brings us full circle back to the octopus, doesn't it? Ready for this? Here's an article on how the octopus works. And in fact, it says here, in addition to confusing predators through color and texture changes, the octopus has a secret weapon, ink. An ink sac is located near its digestive system, and when necessary, the octopus can eject ink out of the sac along with a burst of water from the funnel. The combination creates a black cloud. The octopus can shoot the ink out in little blobs that serve as decoys, or it can shoot it out in one big mass to obscure a quick getaway. To top it off, the ink contains tyrosinase, a compound that impairs smell and taste, which further confuses the predator. Are you kidding me? Smell and taste is what the tyro causes. Now this is getting creepy, because what happens to people who get vidco? They lose their smell and taste. Now I couldn't find anywhere in anything that links tyro to the smack scenes, but what if the mechanisms are similar? Why are people losing smell and taste? And why is that the same exact thing that happens when a squid shoots off ink into a predator? What is it about your nerves, your taste buds, and your smell receptors that's being affected? So, what about the octopus skin cloaking technology? The chromatophore skin cells. Is there copper tyrosinase in the skin? And the answer is yes. Because as we read earlier, tyrosinase is the enzyme behind skin pigmentation, and this article seems to acknowledge the presence of tyrosinase in the octopus cloaking system of the skin. Let's read this. I chose to, let me give you the source here, the chemistry of biological camouflage. I chose to do a chemistry of biological camouflage because I was always interested in how an octopus or chameleon change color. Biological camouflage comes in many different forms. There's self-decoration, motion camouflage, and even disruptive coloration. Although these are interesting, the process of how a chameleon's skin changes color was far more interesting. Therefore, I decided to do a project on changeable skin camouflage. Composition of. There are two different processes for changeable skin camouflage. One process is for vertebrate ectotherms, such as fish, frogs, and lizards. The other is for cephalopods, aka cuttlefish, squid, and octopi. Now, before we keep reading here, you'll remember that we've been covering the weed, which is the tear in the Bible, and people narrowed it down to one specific plant, cephalaria. What are the odds that the tear mentioned in the Bible is likely the same word as a cephalopod, which is an unclean fish? Okay, I'm interrupting myself because there are some great comments going on in the chat. Many of you are making connections with the word tire. Tyre is the place where the blue-blooded seashells were harvested to make royal blue and royal purple colors, to make heliotrope dyes back in antiquity. And so you were like, wow, some of these actors and things have the name Tyre in their name, like Tyra Banks. And I said, and now you've seen the connection between Tyre and copper because of the tyrosinase, right? So banks are full of copper money because all of the cores of all coins, except for pennies, have a copper core. They're mostly copper. All coins. They're coated with nickel. And the penny is the only denomination of coin that is coated now with copper. It used to be solid copper in the 1980s. They changed it to a copper coating. So Tyra Banks is essentially copper is her name, is what it really means. Unbelievable. Then we talked about the name Tyrone, which is a popular ethnic name, isn't it? So these people know what's going on. Let's keep watching here. cuttlefish, squid, and octopus. What are the odds? Now, the word cephalo is supposed to mean head, or the top of, or the head of something. But you get these weird things that seem to suggest that there's something more to this. Now, let's keep reading here. Even though the processes are different, they both have similar components. Both contain chromatophores, which are cells in the skin. These chromatophores consist of different components. For example, vertebrate chromatophore cells have iridophores and melanophores. Iridophores are colorless, stackable plates that scatter light to create blue, green, white, and ultraviolet hues. Melanophores are black. They have huge impact on the vertebrate process. The melanophore in the chromatophore cell consists of eumelanin, a chemical made by tyrosine. Tyrosine's chemical formula is blah, blah, blah. The composition of eumelanin is dioxy whatever. And it says here, these components all make up the inside of chromatophore cell in vertebrates, ectotherm. Now, we get into the cephalopods, because we were talking about vertebrates. Now we're getting into the cephalopods. Not only have chromatophores and iridophores, they also have leucophores. So they contain the tyrosinase technology, just like the vertebrates do, but they also have the leucophores too, which contain guanine. Guanine is in bat droppings, another unclean animal. Guanine is in bat droppings. You know, it's crazy. When I was in college, all guys want to have a band, don't they? And we would do like live mic night. My friend could play the guitar, I would sing, and we had these dreams of becoming a band. Guess what the name of our band was? I understand this was when I was in college. This was 30-something years ago. Guano. Think about how things have come full circle. Think about how the steps that you take through your life end up helping you to solve things later in life. That God can turn dark parts of your life into truth and shed the light on the darkness, can't he? And so this guanine has become one of the, this is actually one of the elements of DNA. One of the parts of DNA. It's the G in DNA sequence. What is it? There's G, there's Gattaca. Remember Gattaca, the movie? Well, that's all of the, not enzymes, what are they? Proteins that make up DNA. So G, A, T, C. Those are the I keep saying enzymes. Proteins that make up DNA. And so guanine is one of those. And you have to ask yourself, is guanine the part of our DNA that is unclean? But here's the crazy thing. You have these shellfish, and they are full of guanine, aren't they? But it's guanine that is part of the process of making a pearl. So out of the unclean, God can make something clean. And that is where Jesus comes in. He is the gap. He is the bridge to the gap. We did a full video on guanine. And these, we were looking at, what were we looking at? I'm trying to go from memory here. We were looking at scallops. And scallops are amazing creatures. Let me look at some pictures of scallops here. So you can see the eyes of these creatures in the wild. Look at this. Now, understand that the pearl doesn't, I don't believe the pearl has the guanine in it. The pearl is actually made up of calcium. But the reason why the eyes of this scallop look like this, and they're all along the ridge of the scallop, is from guanine. And of course, there's lots of guanine that actually causes the coloration on the inside of the shell, that shimmery kind of image on the inside of the shell. You'll see it also in other larger shellfish. When you open the shell, that shimmer is the guanine. Now it's weird because we see this shimmer in different movies, don't we? There was a movie, science fiction movie, that came out not too long ago, in which you saw the shimmery, rainbowy kind of field that came over the people. Maybe you guys can help me in the chat with that movie. And so that is the guanine part of all DNA on our planet. Now this is a whole nother rabbit hole that I'm not going to go into today about DNA, but this gives you some clues, doesn't it? And inside is the pearl. This is the clean. Now, how do we know pearls are clean? Well, because heaven's gates will be made out of pearls. God would not allow anything unclean to be in heaven's gates, would he? The pearl gates at the different, I think there were 12 gates in the New Jerusalem, and each one had a pearl as a door in the book of Revelation. So there's something to this. Jesus bridges the gap. Out of the unclean, he can make the clean, the pearl. Do not throw your pearls before swine. What is that about? Well, swine are unclean. Do not throw the clean before the unclean. Is this all starting to come together now? Amazing. Now let's keep looking at this. Where were we? Okay. So, cephalopods have the tyrosinase, don't they? They have this copper tyrosinase. Now, the last question we have when I go back to the chat here is, are the enhanced cloaking abilities of the octopus because of their hemocyanin copper-based blood? And the answer is yes. The answer is yes. So we've solved another piece of the puzzle. The cloaking of the enemy. The cloning. The counterfeit. Now, you notice I didn't say octopus are bad, or this is bad, or that's are bad. This is all spiritual symbolism. And it's also to help you understand the truth about God's creation. The glory of God comes out of his creation if we simply look. If we simply look and see, then he is glorified through his creation. But many people fail to connect the dots for one reason or another. Okay, let's go into the chat here. That's about all I wanted to present to you guys today. I'll put links to all of this in the pinned comment, as always. It will always be there, so you can dig deeper if you'd like. I barely touched on some of these articles, but there's probably a lot more good information in them. I know a lot of you like to check my work, and I appreciate that. Yes, Sabbath here. The movie is called Annihilation, with the whole shimmering thing. It was like this rainbow shimmery surface that had covered all the people that were exploring this anomaly that was on Earth. And so this is what it's about. If you ever got your hands on an abalone shell, they have very brilliant shimmery surface inside the shell of an abalone. And that comes from guanine. You can look that up. All right. So, what could be the implications of copper being responsible for the melanin content in our skin? That is a good question. What could be the spiritual meaning of that? What could be the physical meaning of that? I don't know. We're going to have to think that through. Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. Got an exciting show today because we'll be exploring the deep biological recesses of the human body to discover something amazing, that the human body is mirrored in the prophecies of the Bible. Now, specifically, our discussion is going to center around copper and its relationship to iron in the human body. Now, these are two trace metals that are necessary for human survival. And what we discovered were that these two metals are at enmity with one another in your body, just as the first prophecy in the Bible explains. Now, to this point in our discussions about copper, we've discovered how closely it is related to the serpent and uncleanness. In fact, the root Hebrew words are very close in describing what copper is, what the serpent is, and what unclean means in the Bible. But here's what we didn't know, and I just discovered this when I was putting together today's investigation, is that trace amounts of copper are necessary for human survival, as well as all other living creatures, mammals. So we're going to be talking about the spiritual and physical implications of this fact today. So the first thing we need to do is get into how copper works in mammals. Now, today's show is going to read much like a biology lesson as we get into some of these topics. And basically, even sheep need trace amounts of copper for survival. Think about the implications of that, the sheep and the goats. Goats need much more copper for survival, and rightfully so. They represent the other bloodline. And according to some of these studies, copper is even necessary for cell communication. And a key regulator of cell signaling pathways. Let's get into this study here and talk about what all of this means. These cell signaling pathways, these neural pathways. Now I'm going to interrupt myself because this is very, very important. And we're going to go about another hour, and then that will be the end of the show today. But in looking at these two videos that I uploaded last year, I'm starting to be able to put more of the puzzle pieces together. Because in the same way that copper is responsible for the neural pathways and communication within the human body, the enemy is trying to make that on a much larger scale, copper being responsible for the communication in the hive mind outside of our bodies. Let's keep watching here. Almost as if we were hardwired with copper. Let's read this. Let's go scroll down this study. Now, the study we're going to be focusing on today and pulling all this information out of is this one. It's called, let me close out some of this stuff so you guys can see this better. It's called Copper Signaling in the Brain and Beyond. And so here's the abstract. We're going to read this first, and then we're going to get into the neurobiology of copper and how it affects our brains and our nervous system. Transition metals have been recognized and studied primarily in the context of their essential roles as structural and metabolic cofactors for biomolecules that compose living systems. Now, as I read through this, I'll be deciphering this for you guys. A lot of this is bio speak, and so it can get a little bit overwhelming. So I will decipher this and break this down for those that don't understand. More recently, an emerging paradigm of transition metal signaling, where dynamic changes and transitional metal pools can modulate protein function. So these metals modulate protein function, cell fate, and organism health and disease. And so it's broadened their view of the potential contributions of these essential nutrients in biology. Using copper as a canonical example of transition metal signaling, we highlight key experiments where direct measurement and or visualization of dynamic copper pools in combination with biochemical, physiological, and behavioral studies have deciphered sources, targets, and physiological effects of copper signals. So basically, this is a study on the role that copper plays in the human body. Now, before we get into this, I want to back up a little bit and show you how copper is at enmity with iron. Taking copper supplements may help people who have anemia because of copper deficiency. Copper works together with iron to form red blood cells, but also if you're eating or if you're taking too much copper, and as you'll see here, it can be dangerous and start to interfere with iron absorption. This particular study talks about high iron consumption impairs growth and causes copper deficiency. The two are at enmity with one another. Let's read this abstract quickly before we get into the bigger study that shows the role. Iron-copper interactions were described decades ago. However, molecular mechanisms linking the two essential minerals remain largely undefined. Investigators in human and other mammals noted that copper levels increase in the intestinal mucosa, liver, and blood during iron deficiency. So, copper levels go up when iron goes down. The current study was undertaken to test the hypothesis that dietary copper influences iron homeostasis during iron deficiency and iron overload. So let's get down to the meat of this. Rats fed low iron diets grew slower than controls, with changes in dietary copper not further influencing growth. Unexpectedly, however, high iron feeding also impaired growth. Furthermore, consumption of high iron diet caused cardiac hypertrophy, anemia, low serum and tissue copper levels, and decreased circulating ceruloplasmin activity. High copper levels in the high iron diet increased serum non-heme iron concentration and transferrin saturation. Serum, let's get down to this part here. We conclude that high iron feeding of weaning rats caused systemic copper deficiency. The two are at enmity with one another, copper versus iron. Now, let's get back into this study and look at the copper and how it interacts in our neural pathways, copper signaling, and neurobiology. Early studies suggesting that copper could serve essential functions outside of enzyme active sites came from the observation by this group. Copper could rapidly release copper upon depolarization. Okay, let's get down into the meat of this. Work from our laboratory provided the first direct imaging evidence for selective and dynamic copper translocation upon neuronal stimulation, showing a redistribution of copper from the cell body to dendrites. Complementary visualization of copper fluxes was observed using fluorescent small molecules. So basically, they saw copper moving between the neuronal pathways, between the dendrites. Mobile neural copper involves labile copper pools. Copper redistribution was dependent on calcium signaling, and additional studies with copper demonstrated that cultured hippocampal neurons and retinal tissue slices contain an endogenous labile pool of copper. So, neurons in the hippocampus and retinal tissues have endogenous copper. that can be depleted by treatment with copper chelators, which is some kind of thing that they use. And some neurons contain pools of copper that are required for spontaneous firing and are mobilized during neural depolarization. So neural depolarization is basically the signaling, initiating a copper signal that is dependent on calcium signaling. So we are literally hardwired with copper. Now, this might be unsettling for some people given the fact that we've already researched copper and that it's basically infects our bodies. And this need for these trace amounts of copper in our bodies doesn't seem natural. And we'll get into why that is later in the show. But the effect of copper signaling on neurotransmission has been explored through all of these studies. Beyond neurotransmitter receptors, an early prediction by this person that copper could bind thiols to enable olfactory function was validated in a study. So what does all that mean? Well, what they seem to say here is that that copper is necessary for you to smell sulfur. Copper is necessary for you to smell sulfur. Smelling sulfur. Copper and silver regulate the response of human odorant receptor. Now, why would this be? Let's read this. Mammalian survival depends on ultrasensitive olfactory detection. So this is a survival mechanism. And it looks like here it says skunks exploit this sensitivity with their nauseous sprays. And it is important for us as a survival mechanism to be able to detect volatile sulfur compounds, since these compounds can signal the presence of rancid food, which of course you don't want to eat. O2 depleted atmosphere, so basically if there's not enough oxygen, and which would be like in a deep cave or something where you might smell sulfur, and predators through carnivore excretions. So what they say here is that copper is a regulator of your ability to smell sulfur. While copper is both an essential nutrient for life and in excess a hallmark of various pathologies and neurodegenerative diseases, its involvement in human olfaction, which is smell, has not been previously demonstrated. When screened against a series of alcohols, thiols, sulfides, and metal coordinating ligands, it responds with enhancement by copper to the mouse semiochemical and derivatives, suggesting compact receptor dimensions. So this is interesting. So now we have a connection between sulfur and copper, which we already knew there was a connection there, didn't we? Because of what the Bible says and how these different peoples were judged with the destruction by sulfur, and how the serpent in the end of times in the book of Revelation will be judged with sulfur, thrown into the lake of fire and brimstone. Brimstone is the old word for sulfur. So here we have another connection to the serpent. Now, as I've dug more into copper, what I found also is that high sugar levels in the body can also cause problems with copper, and copper levels in the body competing with copper. Now, what could that be about? Vitamin C as well and high sugar. People who take high amounts of zinc, iron, or vitamin C may need more copper. Now, don't go crazy and start eating a bunch of copper because it's very hard on the liver, as are all metals. And so you really have to just eat it naturally. Foods that contain copper is oyster, liver, whole grain, breads and cereals, shellfish, dark leafy green vegetables, dried legumes, nuts, and chocolate. Should say dark chocolate. But isn't it interesting that sugary foods can compete with copper absorption? Maybe this is why they're flooding all of our foods with lots of sugar, so that we can't absorb as much copper that is necessary for good health. Now, I'm not into organ meats like beef and liver and kidneys and heart, but apparently they're high in copper as well. Nuts, butter, cashews, macadamia nuts, almonds, pistachios, fruits and vegetables, and all of this other stuff here. Now, what else do we have here? So, we've covered the neuronal pathways. We've covered your ability to smell sulfur, which is unclean, of course, represents basically evil. Flies are attracted to sulfur, aren't they? But also, copper enzymes also regulate melanin in the skin. Now, we covered that in a previous show, so we're not going to cover that again today. But if you're interested in that, copper regulates melanin in the skin. It's actually a copper enzyme. And also affects the circadian rhythm. Copper affects the circadian rhythm and the brain. Let's find that part in this study here. In addition to copper's role in learning and memory, copper has also been shown to influence circadian rhythm. Now, beyond impacting normal neural function, copper directly interacts with prions as well. We've been talking a lot about prion disease. Well, not all prions are bad prions, but the prions that cause disease are bad. Something happens. They start folding in on one another, don't they? Well, according to this, copper directly interacts with some of these prions. And it talks about a precursor to Huntington and spongiform encephalopathy, Alzheimer's, ALS. And it says here that it may serve as a buffer for copper binding in the extracellular space, perhaps at the synapse, which is the area between the neurons. And APP in the network of proteins that regulate neural copper homeostasis. Copper also alerts the activity of glycogen synthase kinase, an enzyme involved in regulating APP processing, linking copper to APP biology through multiple mechanisms. So basically, that's a big word sandwich for copper is very important in brain and spinal cord health. Now you have to wonder, is this why the Egyptians wore the copper serpent on their foreheads? Because they worshipped the copper inside of them. And they knew about copper biology and how the serpent was mixed with the pure blood iron. You have to wonder. Now I'm trying to sift through this study so that I can pull out the parts that make sense to the layman. This is why I'm slowly going through this. But as you can see, it is directly connected to health and disease in the brain. And these connections have been established on biochemical, physiological, and behavioral levels. Now they've got some references here that you can go to, and I'll attach this study, of course, for those of you that want to read further into this, but the point has been made. We are hardwired with copper. It is very much a part of the signaling of the neural pathways. Although neurobiology has been hinted at the prospects of copper signaling, the identification and study of copper signaling in other tissues with more detailed study of specific molecular targets are rapidly expanding. So, this begs the question, Jive G, human batteries. Basically, our bodies contain the elements of what would be in a battery, the copper top battery. We are basically Duracells, just like the Matrix films depict. And how is that going to interact with this new network that they're building all around us as we speak? Now, what else is copper integral in regulating in the body? Well, according to this, the entire immune response. Now, here's where the plot thickens, because what have we been talking about for the past 3 years? Immune responses. Well, according to this, they found that it is dependent, your immune response is dependent on copper. Copper and immunity. Let's read this. This is unbelievable. So now I'm starting to see some links between copper and everything we've been going through for the past 3 years. Now, I don't know exactly what those links are, but this is crazy. Besides the brain, copper is mobilized in other cells and tissues in response to a variety of stimuli, including infection. The antimicrobial properties of copper have been appreciated for centuries, and today copper is used in medical devices to prevent fouling from microbial growth. Appropriately, the mammalian immune system also uses copper's toxicity to prevent microbial growth. So, our immune system has copper in it to stop things from growing in our bodies. So if you don't have enough copper in your body, then things are going to start to grow in your body, right? What happened to our copper? Innate immune cells such as macrophages respond to infection by internalizing microbes into vesicles called phagosomes, which rapidly acidify and are filled with reactive oxygen species. So this is basically the building blocks of our immune system. In a seminal study, Petries and co-workers showed that in response to bacterial or immune stimuli, the ATP7A copper exporter in macrophages moves to the phagosomal membrane in a copper-dependent manner, suggesting that copper is mobilized within the immune cell during an infection and may be pumped into phagosomes as part of the immune response. We all remember the biology study showing how, a pathogen is handled in the human body. Basically, these cells go out in our immune system and surround the thing, don't they? Well, this is seeming to say that copper is part of that. And this is probably what actually kills the thing that is being encircled by our immune system. Let's keep reading here. Indeed, E. coli cells lacking the bacterial copper exporter are less able to survive internalization within macrophages than wild-type E. coli. But this deficit is ameliorated when E. coli cells are internalized within ATP7A macrophages. This data suggests that phagosomal copper negatively affects bacterial growth, such that bacteria possess copper export machinery able to repel a copper insult. So these bacteria have this mechanism in them that can, when they get attacked by the copper, they try to export the copper out of the cells. Wow. Here they talk about yeast, candida. It may harness mobilized phagosomal copper to augment its virulence. So yeast is actually using copper to be more virulent. Copper hyperaccumulation is necessary for yeast virulence in some systems. Wow. As copper mobilization is an internal part of the innate immune response, manipulating labile copper within immune cells may be a viable therapeutic for microbial infections. For example, cellular treatment with copper increases bioavailable copper within cells and reduces microbial growth. As the need for new antimicrobial compounds continues to increase, copper may emerge as a valuable linchpin for gaining leverage over microbial pathogens. It goes even deeper because they're saying here that copper is even what modulates tumor growth in cancer. Let's read this. Controlling cancer with labile copper. I think labile means, I don't know what that word means. What does labile mean? Do you guys know in the chat? Let me check in with you guys and we'll start to finish up this study on copper and talk about the spiritual implications of everything we're talking about today. Did somebody look up labile? Let's take a look here in the chat. And then we'll read about cancer. We're also going to read about fat metabolism and how it is manipulated by how much copper is in your body. And if you don't have enough, you won't burn fat. Anybody know what labile means? I mean, I guess I could look it up. Free copper. Okay, thanks, Andre. Free copper. Okay. No, the Father didn't give us copper on purpose. We were infected with it. The wheats and the tares growing up together. You can't separate them until the end of time, till you've lived your life, because that copper is the infection. It is that little bit of sin in you that taints you. That's why you're born into sin. You're born with this. It's actually in your mother's milk, but it's necessary for survival. We'll get into that later. I want to get through this part first. This is the two bloodlines. Blue bloods versus the red bloods. Copper-based organisms versus the red iron-based organisms. And this is why in nature God gave us the blue-blooded organisms, which are all unclean, by the way, as a reference point so we can identify the difference in the bloodlines. Let's read about cancer. It says here, let's get down into the parts of this that we can understand. Substantial research has been dedicated to understanding and manipulating copper in cancer to prevent cancer progression. Delivery of copper to cancer cells, for example, takes advantage of the oxidizing environment in cancer cells, which is less equipped to buffer increases in copper to cause cell death. System chelation of copper has shown positive results in trials for prevention triple-negative breast cancer. Here we emphasize the growing importance of copper in cancer as a regulator of tumor cell proliferation. In cancer as well as healthy cells, the mitogen-activated protein kinase pathway is a signaling cascade that drives cellular proliferation and differentiation. Activating mutations in upstream components of the pathway lead to constitutive signaling, causing tumorigenesis and tumor growth. So, cancer regulates tumor growth. Now, there's a bunch of more word sandwiches in here, but suffice it to say, Let's get down to some other parts of this. In the melanoma cells carrying the oncogenic BRAF mutation, knockout of the copper importer decreased phospho levels and inhibited cell proliferation. So in other words, they were able to stop the cancer cells from proliferating. Restricting labile copper in mice inhibited the growth of tumors. So less copper, less tumors? This one's a little bit harder to understand, but just understand that copper plays a key role in tumors. It says here, labile copper can play a key role in the growth of cancer, and that restriction of the labile copper pool can inhibit cancer growth. Whoa. The requirement of copper for full MEK activity, probably cancer, that cells or tissues may regulate copper pools to tune the MAPK pathway. So by tuning the pathway, you can do different things to cancer. Integrating a transition metal signal into traditional kinase signal transduction pathways. Indeed, manipulation of copper levels through the administration of copper chelators or ionophores may be an effective way to modulate MAPK signaling, particularly in the context of combination therapies for cancer. Now, what else do we have here? Copper in the regulation of fat metabolism. Why is it that as we get older, it's harder and harder to burn fat, right? Well, let's read about it. Dysregulation of lipid metabolism, fat metabolism, is a symptom of dietary copper deficiency or overload. So you can either have too much or not enough. And so you're not burning fat. Moreover, during the progression of diet-induced non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, liver copper levels decrease. Okay, so copper is stored in the liver, and the bile in your body either releases it or holds on to it. And if it's holding on to too much, then you'll have copper toxicity. There's a couple of different reasons why that happens, but a lot of people don't have enough copper. So what happens is they get issues. Let's read about it. In addition, such nutritional studies linking copper and fat metabolism, the mouse model of Wilson disease, which lacks the copper exporter and accumulates copper in the liver, shows changes in lipid metabolism in the liver before traditional Wilson disease symptoms, such as inflammation and liver failure. A liver-specific ATP7B knockout mouse develops lipid dysregulation without inflammation, suggesting that metabolic symptoms may be directly linked to copper levels and not a secondary symptom of liver inflammation observed in Wilson disease. So these studies linking long-term changes in copper to changes in fat metabolism work from our laboratory identified copper as a newly recognized allosteric regulator of this that controls lipolysis in adipocytes. These are your fat adipocytes, are the fat cells. Lipolysis is the breaking down of triglycerides into glycerol and fatty acids. So, complicated systems our body has, right? But you're getting the drift of this as well. Copper is integral in this burning of fat. Copper deficient adipose tissue isolated from this mouse and stimulated with whatever. Okay, that's getting a little bit complicated. Let's keep reading down here and see if they have a summary sentence. A copper signal acts through allosteric modulation to affect lipolysis in cells and animals. And the data demonstrated the intersection of copper signaling with signaling through the second messenger. Together with dietary and genetic studies, these biochemical studies suggest that manipulation of copper levels may be a viable option for influencing molecular pathways controlling fat metabolism and treating diseases involving dysregulation of lipid homeostasis. Wow. So, now we're going to read the very last paragraph of this study because this is very important. In addition to exploring the origins of copper signals, the ability to manipulate copper signaling may prove an effective therapy, whether alone or in combination with existing therapies, for diseases such as neurodegeneration, infection, cancer, and obesity. Manipulation of copper levels may be achieved most simply by adjustment of dietary copper intake, whereas targeted delivery of copper supplements, chelators or ionophores to specific organs, could serve to mitigate potential toxicities associated with systemic changes to copper homeostasis. So you can either eat it, or they've got these specialized ways that give targeted delivery. I don't know what these things are, if they're like little stents they put in your body. I don't know what that is, but apparently there's ways to target even more specifically above and beyond eating it in your diet. Finally, this short discussion has focused on copper, but this metal represents just one transition metal signaling element in the periodic table of life, and opportunities spanning chemistry, biology, and engineering of metals will surely contribute to a better global understanding of health, aging, and disease. Now, what this says to me is that this is a sign that the entire human race has been contaminated with the serpent copper blue blood. And this gives a whole new context to the copper top battery, doesn't it? Now, I promised you we would get into sulfur, because as we said, in order to smell sulfur, you have to go through copper. Sulfur is the danger odor. And of course, we know that sulfur is often associated with the serpent, the devil. Here's sulfur in the Bible. It's called brimstone, mentioned 14 times in the King James Version of the Bible. And in Isaiah, let's go down to Isaiah here. They show here it's mentioned in a judgment of these peoples. Now, when I go back into this chapter that talks about brimstone in Isaiah, just before this, they actually mention the fiery serpents. The burden of the beasts of the south into the land of trouble and anguish, from whence come the young and old lion, the viper and fiery flying serpent. Probably the same Hebrew words used during the punishment of the Hebrews when they were begging to go back to Egypt. They were attacked by fiery flying serpents. Now this word fiery actually means copper. It's the same word, because copper looks fiery, doesn't it? But you'll see in the Old Testament, when the Israelites were attacked by these fiery serpents, that the word is actually bronze or fiery or copper. So later on in this same chapter is where Isaiah talks about brimstone. For Tophet is ordained of old, for the king it is prepared. He hath made it deep and large. The pile thereof is fire and much wood. The breath of the Lord, like a stream of brimstone, doth kindle it. So, now we see the relationship between copper and sulfur. Just like you need it to smell the sulfur, the two are related. Sulfur is death. So copper is what allows us to smell that death. Now, remember too, that sulfur is the crowned serpent. There's another clue. Sulfur is the crowned serpent, the king of death. Why do I say that? Well, there's a molecule. This is it. It is called the antiprism S8 molecule, and it looks like a double crown. This is the same shape they chose for the one world center of trade, an antiprism, a giant sulfur molecule pointing up toward heaven. Brimstone, the same thing that destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, here's the interesting thing about sulfur. I told you this was going to be a chemistry biology lesson today. Sulfur can form compounds with other elements. All other elements. Principal ores of copper, zinc, nickel, cobalt, molybdenum, and other metals are sulfides. The principal ores are sulfides. So when you find it in the earth, it's a sulfide mixed with sulfur. Sulfur and copper together again. Now, the only elements in the periodic table that do not bind with the sulfides are the gases, the noble gases, as it says here. But this is very interesting nonetheless. In fact, copper ore is a sulfide. So in other words, it is basically created by a reaction with hydrogen sulfide. So what this suggests is that sulfur is an integral part of the metals and actually all elements on the periodic table. Sulfur has literally contaminated our entire reality. And so now the truth emerges about the copper serpent on the pole. And Jesus raised up on the cross the same way. What does that really mean? Why did Jesus say, just as the serpent was raised up, so too the Son of Man will be raised up? It's because we need copper to live in these bodies, don't we? Because the serpent rules this world. But to live beyond this life, we need the purifying blood, the iron blood of Jesus. And the copper competes with that iron, doesn't it? As we demonstrated. So the two are at enmity with one another. Too much iron and you won't absorb copper, which you need to survive. So the two shall grow together, the wheat and the tares. Now, we did a study on the tares, didn't we? And we found that ragweed, which is a probable candidate for what the Bible is talking about when it's talking about tares, was very high in copper content. In fact, ragweed has the highest copper content of almost any plant. We also looked at cephalaria, which is also a candidate for what the tare is mentioned in the Bible. And it also has much more copper than wheat. Whereas wheat is iron dominant. And you can eat a lot of it and get iron without getting other toxicities. And now we understand what the parable meant. Now we understand what the parable meant. The wheat and the tares, both are inside of us. The iron and the copper. You can't take one out because you'll die. They have to grow up together. You have to battle the sin within you. You have to battle the unclean spirit. You have to battle that, overcome it in your life through the power of the Holy Spirit as God refines you. And at the end of time, there's the harvest, and then he can pull it up, right? And basically determine whether or not we are saved. Now, I have one last thing before we get off of here. The Bible says that the eyes are the window to the soul. And that definitely applies to health, doesn't it? In fact, the eyes of people who have too much copper toxicity, their eyes turn copper colored. Wilson's disease. Here's a very obvious example here. A blue-eyed person with copper toxicity, and it forms a ring, a halo, a corona around the eye. So, isn't God amazing? Revealing the metaphors of biology in our bodies and relating that back to the Bible. Now here's the miracle. The miracle isn't that we found this or God revealed this to us. That's not the real miracle here. The real miracle is that the Word of God contained complex biology and chemistry in the actual words of a book that was written down thousands of years ago before anybody knew this. Complex biology and chemistry, the role of copper, the fact that there's even copper in a weed or a tear that competes with iron, the way that iron reacts with copper, the enmity between them. None of that was known 2,000 years ago. Now people argue that, oh, the Egyptians already knew all that stuff. No, they didn't. Otherwise, they would have written it down. They had the serpent on their forehead, the copper serpent, but that was pretty much the extent of it. They used copper quite a bit, but this is just amazing. This is amazing, and we're discovering it all right now. So, what does this mean for your health? Well, you need a little bit of copper, apparently. And so, make sure that you're not just taking iron by itself. You know, in fact, zinc also competes with copper. Now, here is where things get crazy. Because during cold season, according to this article here, I got to make sure I get this part in as well, because this is very important. People dose themselves with lots of zinc and vitamin C, and they actually cause themselves to be deficient in iron. I'm sorry, not iron, copper. Let's look this up here. This is crazy. Be aware that whole grains contain phthalates that bind copper, zinc, and other minerals. This is not to suggest that people shouldn't eat whole grains, but they shouldn't take minerals at the same time. People often do not understand that it matters when and with what they take their supplements. Much like calcium and magnesium, copper and zinc have a sometimes synergistic, sometimes antagonistic relationship. When the balance of zinc and copper is right, these processes proceed well. But, like calcium and magnesium, too much of one diminishes the other. Excesses of either zinc or copper can cause problems. What do we do during the cold and flu season? Let's read. And this is where the Bible is so wise in giving us counsel. It says do everything in moderation. In other words, dosing yourself with large doses of vitamin C, what have we been told? We've been told, oh, Your body just doesn't absorb it. It harmlessly passes through your body. But look at what it really does. During the winter cold and flu season, many people unwittingly induce copper deficiency by gobbling zinc lozenges and heavy doses of vitamin C, believing this will enhance immunity and increase antioxidant capacity. But both zinc and vitamin C compete with or interfere with copper absorption. Because copper is essential for production and activation of neutrophils and all the other things we discovered, right? The first line of defense against pathogens, these neutrophils, excess zinc and vitamin C may actually render people more susceptible to the very ailments they're seeking to avoid. In other words, you start dosing a bunch of zinc and vitamin C. Now, look, eating it daily is fine. And in the context of everything we just read, it's fine. But the minute you start feeling sick, the last thing you should be doing is starting to dose yourself with all this stuff, because you're actually going to make yourself sick. 2 recent papers review the role of copper and other trace minerals in both cellular and humoral immunity. These guys suggest and illustrate that the vicious cycle occurring when micronutrient deficiency suppress T-cell mediated and adaptive antibody responses, thus increasing susceptibility to infection, which in turn increases micronutrient loss, interferes with the metabolism of many nutrients, and reduces nutrient intake. They point out that careful micronutrient supplementation can boost immune function and reduce infection susceptibility. So, make sure your copper and iron levels are correct, and you probably won't get sick. Copper is essential for synthesis of one form of superoxide dismutase, and anything that reduces copper also reduces SOD, diminishing overall antioxidant capacity. People who take high dose of vitamin C to boost their antioxidants may be surprised to learn that they're actually inducing the opposite effect. Anything over 1,000 milligrams of vitamin C per day interferes with copper. So there's your target right there. You don't want to go anything over 1,000 milligrams per day, or you're going to be interfering with your copper. The best way to increase overall antioxidant capacity is by increasing intake of antioxidant-rich foods rather than amplifying one antioxidant vitamin. Wow. So again, I'll put links to all this. I know many of you are chomping at the bit to get these links so you can understand all this. But basically it boils down to moderation, right? Moderation. You don't want to be just downing a bunch of iron all the time without taking the other things with it. Maybe iron and copper together. I don't know. All right, you guys. Wow, that was a lot of stuff. I know some of it was a bit complicated, but hopefully I summarized much of it for you. Let's go into the chat here for a little bit, because I'm curious to see what your guys' thoughts are on all this. All right. Maybe higher copper content in lettuce is key. Yeah, I wouldn't stop eating lettuce. I know I posted something about romaine lettuce having the highest copper content. That was more of an observation and not a recommendation to stop eating romaine lettuce. It appears as though after further study that copper is integral in our bodies functioning properly. But it's also on a spiritual level a sign of the dependence. Think about that for a second, you guys. The copper snake on the pole, that's the side that medicine wants us to go to, isn't it? They want to heighten the copper, don't they? They want us to go to the side of our blood that is dominant with the copper. That's what that means. And Jesus is on the other pole, the other cross. And he wants us to come to him. The two are at enmity with each other. It's so clear to me. I'm just jumping out of my skin right now, because I'm trying to say the right words to help you understand this. Because it is very important. It is very important. Now, if you want to really get your mind blown, You look into copper toxicity and what happens when you have too much of it. And there are different kinds of things about that as well that can happen that seem to mimic a lot of what's happening around us, doesn't it? With how people get sick. So, copper is important for dental health. Daily fasting is the healthiest way to live. I agree with that as well. I could do a lot more fasting. Eat your greens, yes. Explain the eye thing. Well, it's a spiritual manifestation, okay? You've got too much copper and you can actually get Wilson's disease, which is rings in the eye. And isn't it weird that that looks a lot like a corona around the sun, or a corona, a ring, and that the crown, and then the sulfur has the crown as well, the sulfur 8. I mean, to me, the two seem very closely related, and it seems to be spiritually saying something to us. These are called Kaiser Fleischer rings. That's what they're called. Now, most people get what's called a limbal ring around the iris, and it's a dark ring, and those are supposed to symbolize beauty and aesthetic positivity. In other words, people with limbal rings, prominent limbal rings, are said to have more beautiful eyes. Here's an example. If there's a normal limbal ring, the darker the ring, I guess it sets the color off, maybe like an outline, and then it turns into a Fleischer ring with too much copper. So this person would be copper dominant, right? So maybe like more of the copper, the blue blood starting to take over. Now, here's where things get interesting. Start looking at celebrities and see if you see this copper dominance in their eyes. And this is where you're probably going to see the intermixed bloodlines. Okay? I'm just guessing here on that. We'll have to research that and see if we see that. But that would be an indication that they're blue blood dominant, copper dominant. Wouldn't it? So, interesting. Most beings are iron and toxic and copper deficient. Wow. It's also interesting to note that they said in some of these studies that we reviewed that what usually looks like anemia, iron deficiency, is actually copper deficiency. And someone could have plenty of iron but lacks the copper. Let's read this here. Thanks, Eric. Let's read your comment here. So we need a balance. Yes, everything's about balance of iron, zinc, copper, vitamin D, and C. Yes, that is absolutely correct, Erica. Thanks for joining the channel membership. But that is absolutely correct. So when we're talking about these elements here, these trace metals, and we're talking about it, we're really talking about the spiritual metaphors, aren't we? You shouldn't try to get rid of copper in your body because your body actually needs it. But it's a sign that the nature of our reality has become dependent on this copper. It doesn't seem to be there naturally. It seems to be there as some kind of infection, doesn't it? And that came from the bloodlines and how all of creation was basically tainted or infected. That's what this says to me when we really dig into this with everything that we've been talking about. So, all right, you guys, I know that was a really in-depth study, but I know many of you enjoy these studies much more than the Between the Headlines. We will be back on here tomorrow with Between the Headlines. And we will be back on here tomorrow with Between the Headlines. Not sure what we're going to cover yet, but those were the videos that I wanted to show you guys about the brain and how we're all hardwired for copper, and how copper deficiencies develop, and how too much copper can mess you up as well. Hopefully you guys got something out of this live stream, and I will see you guys tomorrow on Between the Headlines. Much love, everybody. Have a great rest of your weekend. Take care and be safe.